Today we will explore the fascinating world of medieval beekeeping, a millenary practice that transformed the relationship between human beings and one of nature's most extraordinary insects, the bee, and which profoundly shaped the economy, religion, and daily life of Europe during the Middle Ages. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. Imagine an open field in the heart of medieval Europe. The morning sun pierces through the canopy of centuries-old oaks and illuminates a small orchard surrounded by wildflowers. A constant, almost hypnotic hum hangs in the air, blending with the distant song of birds. There, among baskets of woven straw arranged in orderly rows, a man approaches cautiously. He carries with him a handful of dried cow dung, which he lights slowly until it produces a dense, acrid smoke. The man leans over one of the baskets, blows the smoke into a small opening and waits. Inside that seemingly simple structure, thousands of bees begin to stir. This man is a beekeeper, and the scene we have just described could have taken place in any European village between the 10th and 15th centuries. The story we are about to tell is the story of an ancient profession, of an extraordinary insect, and of two products that, for centuries, were as valuable as liquid gold: honey and beeswax. To understand the importance of beekeeping in the Middle Ages, one must step back far beyond the walls of castles and Gothic cathedrals. The relationship between humans and bees is one of the oldest documented partnerships between man and the natural world. Rock paintings found in caves in Spain, dating back approximately 6,000 years before the Christian era, 6000 BC, depict human figures climbing cliffs to reach wild hives, equipped with improvised baskets to collect honeycombs. These images, preserved by the rock itself over millennia, reveal that long before any civilization erected its first temples or drafted its first laws, human beings were already seeking honey with determination and courage, facing furious swarms in difficult-to-access locations. Wild honey collection, however, was a risky and destructive activity. There was no refined technique or understanding of the inner workings of a colony. The honey hunter simply located a nest, drove the bees away with fire or smoke, and tore out the combs, frequently destroying the entire colony in the process. It took millennia for humanity to take the next step, to stop being mere looters of wild hives and become bee breeders. The ancient Egyptians were the pioneers in this transition. Around 2450 before the Christian era, 2450 BC, Egypt already possessed a sophisticated and well-organized beekeeping system. On the walls of the Sun Temple of Nusere, belonging to the 5th dynasty, detailed representations can be observed of workers blowing smoke into hives while removing honeycombs. These scenes, sculpted and painted with the characteristic precision of Egyptian art, show that the practice already involved elaborate management techniques. The Egyptians built horizontal hives made of reeds and branches, stacked on top of each other, creating true organized apiaries. Honey was stored in carefully sealed ceramic jars, and some of these containers were found intact in the tombs of pharaohs, including the celebrated Tutankhamun. The fact that jars of honey were deposited alongside treasures of gold, jewels, and sacred objects reveals the extraordinary importance that this substance held in Egyptian culture. Honey was not just food, it was an offering to the gods, an ingredient in funerary rituals, and a component of medicinal recipes recorded in papyri such as the Ebers Papyrus, dated approximately 1500 before the Christian era, 1500 BC. Over the following centuries, beekeeping gradually spread throughout the Mediterranean basin. The ancient Greeks also contributed significantly to the knowledge of bees. Aristotle, the famous philosopher, devoted extensive passages of his works to observing the behavior of these insects, describing their hierarchical social organization with admiration. The Romans, in turn, incorporated beekeeping into their vast agricultural tradition. Virgil, the great Roman poet, celebrated the virtues of bees in his Georgics, emphasizing their importance for agriculture and the economy. The Romans practiced beekeeping with ceramic, cork, and wooden hives, and already recognized the need to position apiaries in locations sheltered from the wind and close to sources of abundant flowers. However, despite all this accumulation of knowledge throughout antiquity, there was still a fundamental gap in human understanding of bees. No one knew, in fact, how colonies reproduced, what the exact role of each member of the swarm was, nor how the combs were built with such geometric precision. These mysteries would remain unanswered for many centuries to come, and it would only be in the medieval period that some of these questions would begin to be addressed in more detail, although still surrounded by misconceptions and superstitions. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, Europe plunged into a period of profound social, political, and economic transformations. Large cities shrank, long-distance trade diminished, and daily life began to revolve around rural communities, feuds, and monasteries. In this new scenario, beekeeping not only survived, but gained even greater importance. Two main factors explain this rise. The first is that honey was, in practice, the only sweetener widely available in Western Europe. Cane sugar, although known in the Eastern Mediterranean lands thanks to contact with the Islamic world, was an extremely rare and expensive product in the rest of the continent, comparable in value to silver. For the vast majority of the European population, from the humblest peasants to the feudal lords, honey was the substance that provided sweetness to food, drinks, and medicinal preparations. The second factor, and perhaps the most decisive one, was the demand for beeswax. With the expansion of Christianity throughout Europe, the need for candles to light churches, cathedrals, chapels, and monasteries grew extraordinarily. Beeswax candles were considered superior in every aspect. They produced a clean and bright flame, did not emit unpleasant odors, and burned uniformly. In contrast, tallow candles, made from animal fat, were cheaper but produced dark smoke and a strong, unpleasant smell. For religious ceremonies, only beeswax was considered worthy of divine service. According to some historical records, the annual demand for wax, just for the royal monastery of St. Mary of Pedralbes in Spain, which brought together 18 religious houses, reached 3,000 kilograms. This data alone illustrates the monumental scale of wax consumption in the medieval world. It was in this context that monasteries became true centers of excellence in beekeeping. Monks and nuns maintained carefully organized apiaries, not only to supply their own needs for wax and honey, but also as a source of income. Many monastic orders viewed bee-raising as an activity that combined manual labor with spiritual contemplation, as bees were often associated with Christian virtues such as diligence, obedience, and chastity. The so-called Church Fathers, as early as the 4th and 5th centuries, had written praises for the bee community, emphasizing the order and discipline of their collective life. Saint Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, compared Christian virginity to the work of bees, which, according to the belief of the time, reproduced without sexual contact. This symbolic association between bees and spiritual purity further reinforced the importance of beekeeping within convent walls. Monasteries are credited as being largely responsible for developing and improving beekeeping practices in England, France, Germany, and much of medieval Europe. But beekeeping was not an activity restricted to the clergy. The aristocracy and large landowners also kept apiaries on their properties. Charlemagne, the powerful Frankish emperor who ruled between 747 and 814, issued decrees ordering that all his estates keep bees and that 2/3 of the honey produced be delivered to the crown. This determination highlights that honey and wax were considered strategic resources subject to taxation and royal control. Laws promulgated during the reign of King Alfred of England, Alfred the Great, between approximately 885 and 899, stipulated that the theft of bees was subject to the severest penalties. In medieval Europe, stealing a swarm of bees was a very serious crime, punished rigorously, as it was equivalent to stealing a valuable source of income and essential resources. Outside the monastery walls and the domains of the nobility, beekeeping was also practiced by peasants and small farmers, although on a much smaller scale. A peasant who owned a few hives could supplement his income by selling honey and wax in local markets. However, nothing was free in feudal Europe. Landowners charged fees in honey or wax when they noticed that third-party bees were collecting nectar in their fields. Villages established fees for the right to practice beekeeping on common lands. Fines were applied against beekeepers who attracted or stole others' swarms, and large-scale beekeepers could be fined if their swarms injured livestock. In forested regions of Eastern Europe, such as Germany, Poland, Russia, Ukraine, and the Baltic countries, a particular form of beekeeping known as tree cavity or hollow log beekeeping developed. Beekeepers hollowed out rectangular cavities in tree trunks and covered them with perforated boards through which the bees could enter and exit. To identify ownership, owners carved marks into the boards. To prevent theft, many of these hives were installed at heights ranging from 5 to 25 meters above the ground. These bee forests, as they were called, could contain between 100 and 500 tree cavities, and the aristocracy and the church were, in most cases, their owners. The most common type of hive in medieval Western Europe, however, was the skep, a relatively simple structure made from woven straw or wicker, shaped like an inverted basket, with a small opening at the base to allow the bees to enter and exit. Skeps were cheap to produce, which allowed even families with few resources to keep 1 or 2 hives. However, they presented a significant limitation. It was not possible to inspect the interior of the hive without disturbing the bees. Unlike modern hives, which have movable frames allowing for the removal and inspection of individual combs, skeps were closed structures. To harvest the honey, the beekeeper had few options. In many regions of northern Europe, the harvest involved the destruction of the entire colony. The bees were killed with dense sulfur smoke, and the combs were then cut out and the honey extracted by pressing. This method, although efficient in terms of extraction, meant the complete loss of the colony, forcing the beekeeper to capture new wild swarms the following spring to restart the process. There was, however, an alternative approach adopted by more experienced and careful beekeepers. In early summer, they would capture wild swarms and, around September, assess which hives seemed most vigorous and most likely to survive the winter. These privileged hives were kept with all their honeycombs intact, and the skeps were wrapped in straw or other insulating materials to protect them from the harsh cold. In this way, the bees had enough food to survive the cold season and could restart their activity in the spring. The other hives, considered less viable, were sacrificed for the harvest of honey and wax. This system, although brutal to contemporary eyes, represented a form of rational management of available resources. Winter was, in fact, the great challenge for medieval beekeepers, especially in the northernmost regions of Europe. Bees depend on stored honey to survive the cold months when there are no flowers available for foraging. If the beekeeper harvested too much honey, the colony could starve before spring. In the warmer lands of the Mediterranean, keeping bees during the winter was relatively simple, as the mild climate allowed for shorter periods of inactivity. But on the frozen plains of Central and Northern Europe, where winters could be long and relentless, colony mortality was high. Many swarms simply did not survive, and the beekeeper had to start from scratch each season. It is at this point in our narrative that an extraordinary document emerges, a work that offers us a rare glimpse into the beekeeping practices of the medieval period with a wealth of detail unusual for the time. This is the Geoponica, a collection of 20 books on agriculture, compiled in the 10th century in Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, by order of Emperor Constantine VII's Porphyrogenitus. The Geoponica is the only Byzantine agricultural work that has survived to our days, and its content is a compilation of writings by ancient and Byzantine authors, gathering centuries of practical knowledge on various aspects of rural life, from viticulture to animal husbandry. For us, the most important part is the chapter dedicated to bees and beekeeping, which contains fascinating observations and practical advice that reveal a surprising level of sophistication. The Geoponica begins with a laudatory description of bees that deserves to be mentioned for the beauty and precision of its observations. The text states that the bee is the wisest and most ingenious of all animals, the closest to the human being in intelligence, and that its works are truly divine and of great utility to humanity. The social life of bees, the text continues, resembles that of the best-governed cities. On their excursions, the bees follow a leader and obey instructions. They bring back sticky secretions from flowers and trees and spread them like ointments on their floors and entrances. The text also observes that bees are pleased by good music and that when they disperse, beekeepers beat plates or clap rhythmically to bring them back. The work also describes the hatred that bees harbor for laziness, stating that they unite to kill those that do not work and consume the production of others. The mechanical skill and almost logical understanding of bees, the text adds, are demonstrated by the fact that they build hexagonal cells to store honey. These descriptions, although imbued with an anthropomorphic view that attributes human qualities such as wisdom, justice, and obedience to bees, reveal centuries of attentive and detailed observation. The Byzantines of the 10th century saw in bees a mirror of the ideal human society, a model of collective organization that inspired admiration and respect. It is interesting to note that the text refers to the leader of the hive as a king, reflecting the feudal structure of medieval society. Only many centuries later would European naturalists discover that this supposed king was, in fact, a queen, the only fertile female in the colony, responsible for all the reproduction of the swarm. In addition to naturalist observations, the Geoponica offers extremely valuable practical advice for beekeepers. The text recommends that the best hives be built with boards of beech, fig, pine, or oak wood, and that they should be approximately 1 cubit wide and 2 cubits long. The hives were to be rubbed on the outside with a mixture of ash and cow dung. This external treatment possibly helped to seal cracks and protect the wood from moisture and predatory insects. Regarding the honey harvest, the Geoponica offers guidelines that demonstrate a remarkable understanding of the delicate balance between the exploitation of hive resources and the maintenance of the swarm's health. The text recommends that honey be harvested 3 times a year, the first in early May, the second during the summer, and the third and final one around October. However, the text gives a crucial warning. One must not remove all the honey from the hive. If all the honey is removed, the author warns, what will happen is that the bees will become furious and stop working. The specific recommendation is to leave 1/10 of the honey during the first 2 harvests and 2/3 before winter. The reason for this larger proportion in the last harvest is simple and pragmatic. Bees need the stored honey as food during the cold months when they cannot go out to forage. Removing an excessive amount of honey before winter would mean condemning the colony to hunger and death. This guidance reveals a practical wisdom that transcends centuries. The Byzantine beekeepers of the 10th century intuitively understood what modern science would confirm much later, that the sustainable exploitation of a natural resource requires the preservation of the source's productive capacity. By leaving a generous portion of the honey for the bees, the beekeeper guaranteed the survival of the colony and, consequently, the continuity of production in the following harvests. The Geoponica also addresses one of the most immediate concerns of any beekeeper: how to avoid painful stings during the honey harvest. It is important to remember that the protective suits we know today, with their mesh masks, thick gloves, and sealed overalls, are a relatively recent invention. Medieval beekeepers did not have this type of equipment, and harvesting honey was, literally, an activity that required physical courage. The Geoponica suggests some methods to minimize the risk of stings. The first and most widespread was the use of smoke produced by burning dried cow dung. Smoke has a calming effect on bees because it simulates the presence of a forest fire and triggers in the bees the instinct to gorge themselves on honey, preparing for an eventual flight. Satiated bees are less aggressive and less likely to sting. The second method described in the text involves anointing exposed skin with the juice of wild mallow, a plant that it was believed possessed repellent properties against bees. The third method is the most elaborate and deserves to be described in detail for its ingenuity. The recipe instructs the beekeeper to take toasted fenugreek flour, add a decoction of wild mallow with olive oil until the mixture reaches the consistency of honey. Apply this paste generously to the face and all exposed skin, put a little in the mouth and blow into the hive 3 or 4 times. Although the actual effectiveness of this recipe is difficult to assess in light of modern knowledge, it reveals the creativity and ingenuity of medieval beekeepers in seeking solutions to a very concrete practical problem. The Geoponica is not limited to offering advice on management and protection. The text also presents a detailed description of what constitutes high-quality honey. According to the work, the ideal honey should be translucent, pale yellow in color, smooth to the touch, capable of stretching into a long thread when pulled, forming a raised point that descends slowly, thick when it separates with reluctance, and endowed with a good aroma. This description is remarkably precise and practically identical to the criteria used by honey experts to this day. Light color, high viscosity, the ability to form long threads, and a pleasant aroma are recognized indicators of pure, high-quality honey. The geoponica also offers seasonal advice for the care of swarms throughout the year. To feed young bees, it recommends placing wine mixed with honey in basins, adding flowering, savory leaves so that the bees do not drown. To feed the swarms when they run out of food because of cold or heat, it suggests crushing raisins and savory, and offering this mixture with barley cakes. In the spring, the beekeeper should lead the bees to the pastures with smoke from dried cow dung, and then clean and sweep the hives. If there are too many combs, the text advises removing the worst ones so that the bees do not get sick from overcrowding. These instructions reveal a refined, practical knowledge that remains valid in modern beekeeping. Let us now turn our attention to the two products that made beekeeping such a coveted and economically significant activity in the medieval period: honey and wax. Although both were highly valued, each played distinct roles in the daily life, economy, and culture of the time. Honey, as we have already mentioned, was the main sweetener available in medieval Europe. In an era when cane sugar was a luxury accessible only to the wealthiest, honey was the substance that sweetened the lives of the vast majority of the population. It was used to flavor beer, wine, and cereal porridge, which was a staple food for many medieval Europeans. Porridge, a simple preparation made from grains such as oats, barley, or wheat cooked in water or milk, was consumed daily by peasants and even by members of the minor nobility. The addition of honey transformed this modest dish into a more palatable and nutritious meal. Honey was also used to preserve fruit and to prepare various types of sweets and confections, although medieval confectionery was a restricted art, practiced mainly in the kitchens of the most affluent. One of the most notable applications of honey in the Middle Ages was the production of mead, an alcoholic beverage obtained by the fermentation of honey diluted in water. Mead is one of humanity's oldest alcoholic drinks, mentioned in poems and sagas of various European cultures since at least the 5th century. In the Norse and Anglo-Saxon tradition, mead held a prominent place in culture and social rituals, being the drink par excellence for banquets and celebrations. Medieval monasteries also produced mead, using fermented honey to create a drink that was both pleasurable and, according to the medicine of the time, beneficial to health. Medieval medicine followed the theory of the 4 humours, according to which health depended on the balance between hot, cold, moist, and dry in the human body. Mead was considered a warming and moistening drink, indicated for combating the ills of winter, respiratory problems, and states of melancholy. Anglo-Saxon medical manuscripts contain dozens of recipes that use honey wine as a base for the administration of medicinal herbs, demonstrating that mead was both a social drink and a pharmaceutical vehicle. The medicinal properties of honey were also recognized and widely exploited in the Middle Ages. People of the time did not know the scientific mechanisms behind the antibacterial action of honey, but practical experience demonstrated that honey was effective in treating wounds. When applied to cuts and burns, it helped prevent infection and accelerate healing. Modern science has confirmed that honey possesses genuine antimicrobial properties. Its acidic pH inhibits bacterial growth. Its high sugar concentration draws moisture from microorganisms through osmosis, and the presence of hydrogen peroxide provides a direct antiseptic effect. Furthermore, the viscosity of honey creates a protective physical barrier over the wound. One of the most famous cases of the use of honey in medieval medicine involves the future King Henry V of England. In 1403, while still a 16-year-old prince, Henry was struck in the face by an arrow during the Battle of Shrewsbury. The projectile penetrated deep into his cheek, and the arrowhead became lodged inside the wound. The royal surgeon, John Bradmore, devised an audacious plan to extract the projectile, which involved the use of probes soaked in rose honey to clean and disinfect the wound throughout the removal process. Bradmore inserted rods of increasing size into the wound over several days, always applying honey, until the opening was large enough to allow the removal of the barbed arrowhead. The procedure took days, but the prince survived and recovered, although he was left with a significant scar on his face. This episode is a remarkable testament to the skill of medieval surgeons and the crucial role that honey played in the medical practice of the time. Honey was also recognized for its benefits in treating throat and respiratory problems. Mixtures of honey with herbs, spices, and other ingredients were prepared as remedies for coughs, hoarseness, and sore throats. This application of honey as a balm for the respiratory system has roots dating back to antiquity and continues to be recognized by folk medicine to this day. The preservation of honey was another matter of practical interest. Unlike many other foods, honey possesses extraordinary durability. When stored properly, it can remain edible for extremely long periods. Its longevity is attributed to the same properties that give it antimicrobial action: the presence of hydrogen peroxide, natural acidity, and very low water content. Jars of honey found in Egyptian tombs thousands of years old were considered still edible, an impressive testament to this capacity for preservation. Let us now turn our attention to the second major product of medieval beekeeping: beeswax. If honey was the universal sweetener, wax was the substance that lit the medieval world. In an era before electricity, piped gas, and even kerosene, sources of artificial light were limited and precious. For the vast majority of the population, the darkness of night was broken only by the glow of fires and occasionally by tallow candles made from melted animal fat. These tallow candles, although widely used because they were more accessible, had considerable disadvantages. They burned irregularly, produced dark smoke, and emitted a strong, unpleasant odor. Beeswax, in contrast, offered a completely different experience. Beeswax candles produced a pure and bright light, burned uniformly and steadily, and emitted practically no odor. For these reasons, beeswax was the preferred and often mandatory material for the manufacture of candles intended for religious ceremonies. The Catholic Church, which dominated the spiritual life of medieval Europe, consumed enormous quantities of wax candles in its daily rituals, from morning masses to night vigils, as well as the celebrations of saints, processions, and the offices of the canonical hours that punctuated the routine of the monasteries. Every altar, every side chapel, every shrine of relics was illuminated by pure wax candles. In large cathedrals, the annual consumption of candles could be colossal. The religious demand for wax was so intense that domestic production was frequently insufficient. In medieval England, large quantities of wax had to be imported from Spain, Eastern Europe, especially Russia and Poland, and even North Africa. One of the main exporting centers was the city of Béjaïa in present-day Algeria, whose name gave rise to the French word for candle, bougie. France imported even larger quantities of wax than England. The economic importance of wax was so great that in many regions it was considered more valuable than honey itself. While honey could be partially replaced by other natural sweeteners, such as dried fruits or fruit syrups, beeswax had no adequate substitute for the manufacture of quality candles. This disparity in value explains why the theft of skeps was a relatively common and severely punished crime in the medieval period. A hive represented not just a source of honey, but above all a supplier of wax for which demand was constant and growing. After the harvest, the honey and wax had to be separated from each other. For most of the Middle Ages, this process was carried out by pressing. The combs were placed in containers and pressed, forcing the liquid honey to drain out, while the wax remained as a solid residue. After the extraction of the honey, the wax was washed to remove any remaining honey residue, and could then be molded into blocks or processed for various uses. This pressing method was effective but destructive. The combs were completely crushed in the process, forcing the bees to rebuild them entirely. Building combs is a task that requires an enormous expenditure of energy and resources from the bees. To produce a single kilogram of wax, a bee needs to consume between 6 and 7 kilograms of honey. The destruction of the combs at each harvest, therefore, represented a significant waste and reduced the overall productivity of the hive. This limitation of pressing would only be overcome many centuries later. In 1865, a retired Austrian officer and beekeeper named Franz Hruschka invented the first centrifugal machine for honey extraction. Inspired by the centrifugal machines used in sugar refineries, Hruschka built a cylindrical metal drum with an internal structure where the uncapped honeycomb frames were fixed. By turning the crank, centrifugal force threw the honey against the cylinder walls, from where it drained to the bottom. The revolutionary aspect of this invention was that the combs, now empty, could be returned intact to the hive, saving the bees an extraordinary amount of time, labor, and energy. Hruschka presented his invention at the 14th Conference of German and Austrian Beekeepers, held in Brno between September 12 and 14, 1865, causing great enthusiasm and transforming the practice of beekeeping. But let us return to the medieval world, where beeswax had uses that went far beyond the manufacture of candles. One of the most important was the production of seals. In the Middle Ages, official documents such as royal charters, decrees, treaties, and contracts were authenticated by means of wax seals. The procedure consisted of mixing beeswax with a resin, melting the mixture, and applying it to the document. While the wax was still soft, the king, noble, or ecclesiastic would press his personal signet, a metal matrix engraved with a distinctive design or coat of arms, creating a unique impression that functioned as an inviolable signature. The presence of the seal attested to the authenticity of the document and the commitment of its issuer to the content recorded therein. Wax seals became fundamental elements of medieval administration, and their integrity was taken extremely seriously. Damaging or forging a royal seal was a crime of extreme gravity. Beeswax also found application in the craft of sewing. Medieval artisans used wax to wax linen threads or other materials before sewing them, a process that strengthened the fibers, made them more resistant to tension, and facilitated their passage through fabrics. This technique was especially important in the manufacture of footwear, bags, horse harnesses, and other leather goods that required robust and durable stitching. Polishing was another relevant use for beeswax. When mixed with mineral oil, wax produced an effective polish for wood, providing shine and protection to the treated surfaces. Furniture, musical instruments, and ornamental wooden objects could be treated with this mixture to enhance the beauty of the wood grain and protect it against moisture and insects. Wax was also employed in the polishing of metals and leather armor, giving them a smooth finish and a protective layer against oxidation and wear. In addition to all these practical uses, beeswax played an important role in artistic casting. The technique known as lost wax casting involved creating a wax model of the desired object, encased in clay. By heating the mold, the wax would melt and run out, leaving a hollow cavity. Molten metal, usually bronze, was then poured into the cavity. This method allowed for the creation of sculptures, bells, and decorative objects of great complexity, contributing even more to the demand for beeswax. Throughout the entire Middle Ages, therefore, honey and beeswax permeated practically all aspects of European life: food, medicine, religion, administration, craftsmanship, art, and commerce. Beekeeping was an activity that connected the humblest peasant to the most powerful monarch, the contemplative monk to the itinerant merchant, the surgeon to the confectioner. Bees, with their admirable social organization and their ability to transform the nectar of flowers into honey and wax, occupied a central place in the medieval economy and culture. It is fascinating to observe how the relationship between human beings and bees evolved over the centuries following the Middle Ages. During the medieval period, beekeepers worked with essentially empirical knowledge, based on observation and experience accumulated over generations. They knew how to manage their hives, when to harvest the honey, how to protect the swarms during the winter, and how to use smoke to calm the bees, but they were unaware of the biological foundations that explained these phenomena. They did not know, for example, that the queen bee was a female and not a king. They did not understand the reproduction mechanism of bees, nor the role of drones in fertilization. They did not know the chemical composition of honey, nor understand why it possessed antimicrobial properties. It was only in the 18th century that European naturalists began to systematically investigate the biology of bees. Jean Swammerdam, René-Antoine Ferchaud de Réaumur, Charles Bonnet, and François Hubert are among the pioneers who used microscopes and dissections to unravel the internal anatomy of bees and understand the mechanisms of their social organization. This research revolutionized beekeeping, allowing for the development of much more efficient management techniques. The most significant advancement was the invention of the movable frame hive. In 1838, the Polish beekeeper Johann Dzierzon developed the first practical hive with movable combs. This idea was refined by Lorenzo Langstroth, an American pastor and beekeeper, who in 1852 patented his design based on the concept of bee space, a precise distance between the combs that bees naturally respect. The Langstroth hive allowed any frame to be removed for inspection without disturbing the rest of the swarm, checking the health of the queen and harvesting honey selectively. Combined with Hrushka's centrifugal extractor, the movable frame hive transformed beekeeping into a productive, sustainable, and scientifically grounded activity. These innovations, however, do not diminish the merit and ingenuity of medieval beekeepers. Working with rudimentary tools, limited knowledge, and in often adverse conditions, these men and women managed to develop management practices that kept beekeeping alive and productive for centuries. The geoponica, with its advice on harvest frequency, the proportion of honey to be left for the bees, methods of protection against stings, and criteria for honey quality, is eloquent testimony to the sophistication that medieval beekeeping had achieved. Many of the principles established in that work remain valid today, demonstrating that practical wisdom accumulated through experience can anticipate the conclusions of formal science by centuries. The history of medieval beekeeping is ultimately a story of interdependence. The bees depended on the protection and management offered by the beekeepers, who provided them with shelter, seasonal care, and in some cases supplementary feeding during periods of scarcity. Human beings, in turn, depended on the bees to obtain two indispensable products: honey, which sweetened their food, healed their wounds, and brightened their feasts, and wax, which illuminated their churches, authenticated their documents, strengthened their threads, and polished their armor. This symbiotic relationship, built over millennia, is one of the most beautiful and enduring examples of the human capacity to cooperate with the natural world for mutual benefit. When we look at a simple beeswax candle lit on a medieval altar, or at a pot of golden honey glowing under the sunlight streaming through a 13th century kitchen window, we are not just seeing utilitarian objects. We are seeing the result of an extraordinary process that begins in the petals of a wildflower, passes through the mandibles and glands of thousands of worker bees, crosses the calloused hands of a beekeeper who risks painful stings to harvest the fruits of his labor, and ends by illuminating a sacred space or sweetening a family's meal. Each drop of honey and each fragment of wax carries with it this silent history of cooperation between species, of human ingenuity, and of nature's generosity. Medieval beekeeping teaches us that even in the most difficult times, human beings found creative ways to work with nature, respecting its rhythms and taking advantage of its gifts. The beekeepers of the Middle Ages did not possess microscopes, nor centrifuges, nor sophisticated protective suits. But they possessed centuries of patient observation, of trial and error, of wisdom passed from master to apprentice, from father to son, from monk to novice. This heritage of practical knowledge is the foundation upon which modern beekeeping was built. The hum of the bees that resonated in the orchards and fields of medieval Europe continues to echo in the apiaries of today. Techniques have changed, equipment has evolved, and science has unraveled many of the mysteries that intrigued the ancients. But the essence of the relationship remains the same, a silent pact between the human being and the bee based on mutual respect and fair exchange. Medieval beekeepers understood, perhaps instinctively, what modern ecology proclaims with growing urgency: that bees are indispensable for life on Earth, not only for the honey and wax they produce, but for the vital role they play in the pollination of plants, ensuring the reproduction of countless plant species and, by extension, the feeding of the entire food chain. Just as the honey preserved in Egyptian jars crossed millennia without deteriorating, the history of medieval beekeeping crosses the centuries without losing its relevance and fascination. It is a story of ingenuity and perseverance, of faith and commerce, of incipient science and ancestral wisdom. It is the story of how a tiny insect, armed only with its delicate wings, its precise mandibles, and its fearsome stinger, helped to light cathedrals, heal wounds, sweeten life, and seal the destinies of kings and nations. And just as the bees unfailingly return to the hive at the end of each journey, carrying with them the precious nectar they gathered throughout the day, we too return at the end of this narrative, carrying with us a bit of the honey of knowledge. If this journey into the world of medieval beekeeping awakened in you the same curiosity and admiration we felt while researching and narrating this story, then the invitation we make now is simple. Just as bees strengthen their hive by sharing nectar with their companions, strengthen this channel by sharing this content with those who are also enchanted by the stories the past has to tell us. Subscribe, leave your comment with your impressions and your questions, and hit that like button so we can continue producing more narratives like this one. Every subscription, every like, every comment is like a drop of honey that feeds the hive of this channel and allows us to keep exploring the most fascinating corners of human history. Until the next journey.